Hello, everyone, and welcome into the Star Wars Legends Lounge, the show that celebrates the books from Star Wars Legends. I'm Aaron Moats. It's the day after Thanksgiving here in the United States. Thanksgiving is my favorite holiday of the year. Food, fun, and family all gathered around, just enjoying each other's company, without the pressure that sometimes comes with Christmas. We did Thanksgiving at my brother's house yesterday, and it was great. We had two pieces of difficult family news earlier this month, so it was really cool just to have everyone gather around the house and watch the Macy's parade and eat dinner and laugh and play cards and just have a little bit of normalcy back in the house for the first time in a few weeks. If any of you listeners celebrate Thanksgiving, I hope you also had a great time. And if you have a tradition of shopping all the deals today and for the weekend with your friends and family, I hope you have a great time. Enjoy the time you have with the people who are important to you. And if you prefer spending your time by yourself, like I do most of the time, enjoy it. Read a book, watch TV, take a hike, do whatever activities invigorate you. That being said, if you're listening to this podcast, you probably enjoy Star Wars Legends. On today's show, we jump ahead to the time following the events of the Jedi Academy trilogy. Leia and Han lead a diplomatic mission to Ithor when an old smuggling buddy from Han's past issues a dire warning. Kill you. Kill you all. The man's ramblings send Han and Leia to a sparsely populated world where a new resistance is forming, while Luke searches for a derelict Imperial battle station that just mysteriously turned itself on. It's Children of the Jedi by Barbara Hambly, the first book in what many fans call the Callista Chronicles. But before we get into the book, it's listener question time. I have two messages today. The first comes from Robin. Robin says, I have started sharing the Jedi Padawan books by Jude Watson with my young nephew. I am gifted at reading aloud to others, and I think he's the right age and these are the right books to introduce him to the Star Wars universe. There is clear good versus evil stories, and evil gets punished at the end. It feels a little like playing a computer game with him. I always ask, what would he do next as young Obi-Wan Kenobi? I hope he doesn't get too close to Qui-Gon Jinn, or the Phantom Menace will be a shock for him in the future. What books from the Star Wars universe would you read to your children if you had any? Well, thank you very much for the email, Robin. I have not read the Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan books yet, which are called the Jedi Apprentice series here in the United States. I've heard from a lot of fans, 10 to 20 years younger than myself, who really like those books. I'll be reading them for the first time at the beginning of 2026. To answer your question, Robin, I did try to introduce both my niece and nephew to Star Wars books when they were younger, between the ages of 5 and 8. Both were voracious readers when they were younger, and they both enjoyed the Star Wars movies and the first season of The Mandalorian. So I thought they might like to try some Star Wars books. I started them out with the Junior Jedi Knights series starring Anakin Solo. I also lent them the first couple books in the Galaxy of Fear series, and I gave them the first young reader's book in the High Republic series, A Test of Courage by Justina Ireland. They weren't interested in any of them. In fact, after the first season of The Mandalorian, both of them pretty much lost all of their interest in Star Wars, except for Grogu merchandise. My niece is much more interested in any musical television shows and movies, and my nephew cares a lot more for Marvel superhero stories and for video games. Now, maybe someday they'll show more of an interest in Star Wars. I hope so. And if they do, I'll be here for them to share their excitement and to answer their questions and just talk to them about the galaxy far, far away. Thank you very much for the question, Robin. Today's second email comes from Ian. Ian says, "Hi, Aaron. I recently discovered your podcast. I'm a truck driver and have already gotten through 50 episodes. So thank you for riding shotgun with me for my 700-mile daily drive." Well, you're quite welcome, Ian. Thank you for the kind words. Ian continues, "When I started reading the expanded universe, when new characters were introduced in the books, I would try to imagine who might portray them on the screen. For example, back in the 90s, I imagined Nicole Kidman as Mara Jade and Kevin Kline as Talon Card. Today, I could imagine Karen Gillan as Mara and Robert Downey Jr. as Card. I was just wondering if you did the same, and maybe some of your listeners do too." Well, thank you very much for the email, Ian. I've gotten a few versions of this question before, but I don't think I've ever answered it here on the show. It's something that I know a lot of Legends fans think about when they read these books, but I'll be honest, I never did. And I know I'm an outlier. A little about myself, Ian. I never really played pretend very much when I was a kid. I had toys and action figures, but I didn't play with them much. I mostly played outside, running around, playing wiffle ball, riding bikes, playing tag, stuff like that. Now, as an adult, I tried role-playing games 5 different times, but using my imagination just isn't something I do very much. In fact, I don't really enjoy it. I say all this, Ian, because when I read a book and picture the stuff happening in my head, I only ever see images that I'm familiar with. If it's a character in a book that I already know from a movie or a television show, that's who I picture. But for characters that only exist in a book, like the ones that were introduced in the 90s in the expanded universe, I just always pictured what the character looked like on the cover art. That's it. And for books that don't have cover art, I really don't imagine anything specific. For example, Mara Jade and Talon Card are not shown on the cover of Heir to the Empire. Over the years, I've seen a lot of fan art about what the two characters look like. But back when I read the book for the first time, and before I ever saw any of that fan art, to me, Mara Jade looked like generic redheaded woman, and Talon Card looked like generic middle-aged man with long dark hair and goatee. That's it. I just never picture specific people unless I have already seen it. But I'm sure that's not the answer you want to hear, Ian, and that's not the answer anyone else listening to this wants to hear. So I tried to force myself to come up with some people to play Mara Jade and Talon Card. And much to my embarrassment, I didn't come up with anybody. Thankfully, that's what Google is for. For Mara Jade, I searched actresses in their 20s and 30s because in Heir to the Empire, Mara is about 26 years old. And for Talon Card, I searched for actors in their 40s and 50s because Card is middle-aged in that book. And you know what? Even looking at all those faces, none of them look right to me. The closest I came was Kristen Stewart and Oded Fair, but even they don't look quite right in my mind's eye. So let me open it up here to all of the listeners out there. What actors today do you think would make a good Mara Jade and a good Talon Card? And if you don't think anyone today would, how about any actors or actresses throughout the years that you think would be good for those characters? Or how about anyone else in Star Wars Legends who would make a good Corran Horn? Who would make a good Ayala Wasiri or an Admiral Dala? I'd love to read your choices out on the show. Thank you once again for the question, Ian. Now, listener, if you have a question for the show, send me an email at swlegendslounge@gmail.com or send me a message on Twitter, Instagram, or Blue Sky at swlegendslounge. And if you'd like to get your voice on the show, just record a short message and email it in. But please record it in MP3 audio format. Now, coming up at the end of the show, we're going to hear from Ian again, as he has a few opinions about some of the stuff I've said on the podcast. You're going to want to stick around for that. Now it's time for today's book, Children of the Jedi by Barbara Hambly. Grab yourself a drink. Let's head in to the Star Wars Legends Lounge. The story begins on the planet Ithor. Chief of State Leia Organa Solo leads a group of New Republic representatives to attend the Time of Meeting. It's an event held every 3 years where the great Ithorian herd ships gather over a certain spot on the planet. It's an opportunity for the Ithorians to exchange information and a time for solemn ritual and celebration. But this year, the Time of Meeting is interrupted. One of Han's old smuggling buddies, a man named Drub Macum, pushes his way through the crowd. "Solo!" he cries, a crazed look in his eyes. Luke steps in front of the smuggler, stopping him from grabbing Han. "Kill you! Kill you all!" he screams. Quickly, Luke and Chewie take hold of the man and turn him over to New Republic authorities. Later, caught amid a drug-induced haze, Drub mumbles something about children. "They hid the children in the well. Plett's well," he says. After doing a little research, our heroes guess that Drub is talking about something in the town of Plawwal on the nearby planet Belsavis. A few decades ago, Plawwal was known as Plettwell, after an old Jedi master who built a laboratory in the frozen Plawwal Rift Valley to study the effects of using the hydrothermal vents to grow commercial plants. After Order 66, Jedi Master Plett used his lab to hide Jedi and their children from the Empire. Two of Luke's Jedi students, Cray Mingla and Nikos Mar, say they remember their parents talking about Plett's well. Cray and Nikos were scientists before joining the Jedi Order, and they were former lovers. A year ago, Nikos was diagnosed with a terminal illness, but Cray used her expertise in artificial intelligence to try to upload Nikos' consciousness into a droid body until doctors could find a cure for his illness. Luke uses the Force to search Nikos' memories and discovers a set of coordinates. They point to a spot in space inside the Moonflower Nebula near the planet Pzob. Luke decides to take Cray, Nikos, and 3PO to check out the coordinates, while Han, Leia, Chewie, and R2 go to Plawwal to investigate Drub's message about Jedi children. When they arrive in the Moonflower Nebula, Luke and his companions find a group of asteroids. Luke notices that one of them has a bunch of strange-looking holes in it. They fly in to get a better look, when their shuttle is hit by a series of turbolaser bolts. The blasts damage most of the shuttle's systems. With their engines failing, Luke crash lands on Pzob. There, they find the planet inhabited by two warring colonies of Gamorreans and a human named Triv Pothman, a former stormtrooper who was stationed on Pzob since before Luke destroyed the first Death Star. Luke, Cray, and Nikos tell Triv about the attack in the Moonflower Nebula and ask him if he knows what's hidden inside. The former stormtrooper says his garrison was waiting for a ship called the Eye of Palpatine, but it never arrived. Triv starts to tell Luke what happened to his fellow troops when dozens of strange probes descend from the sky. The probes begin stunning the humans and Gamorreans. Luke tries to stop a probe from shooting Cray when he's blasted by one of the stun rays and falls unconscious. Meanwhile, Han Solo and Princess Leia arrive on Belsavis and start searching Plawwal for any information about Jedi children. Han and Chewie uncover a series of tunnels beneath Plett's old house and find it full of former smugglers suffering from madness just like Drub McCum. Meanwhile, Leia meets a woman she recognizes from her days back in the Imperial Court. Rogonda Ismarin was one of the newest members of the court, Leia recalls. She wasn't a member of one of the galaxy's ancient houses, unlike Leia, but she seemed to be very close to Emperor Palpatine. Rogonda tells Leia that after the Emperor's death, she fled Coruscant with her young son. Rogonda says they've been hiding out in Plawwal ever since. But Leia senses something off about Rogonda. The woman was always devious, and now Leia can tell she's lying. Luke wakes up in an Imperial-style infirmary with 3PO standing over him. Luke's leg is severely injured. 3PO helps Luke find some painkillers and makes him a crutch. The two start exploring the facility and discover the Gamorreans talking and acting like Imperial stormtroopers. They also find other aliens, including Tals, Afetekans, and Kedonaks, some acting like Imperials, and some not. But there's no sign of Krey, Nikos, or Triv. But a voice orders everyone to gather around the computer terminals. There, Luke sees Triv wearing stormtrooper armor and strapping Krey to a pole. Nikos stands nearby, but the droid man is unable to move, a restraining bolt rendering him immobile. The voice declares that Krey is a rebel spy and condemns her to death in 2 days. Leia, Han, and Chewie spend the night in one of Plawwal's local inns. Something wakes Leia up in the middle of the night, a quiet whirring noise coming from near the door. She wakes up Han and turns on the light. Startled, the two see R2 standing at the end of the bed. The little droid has locked the door and sets Han and Leia's blaster packs to self-destruct. Han leaps out of bed and tries to grab the packs, but R2 whips out his arc welder and rolls in front of Han. Chewie starts pounding at the bedroom door, but there's no chance the Wookiee can break it down before the packs explode. Quickly, Leia grabs a glass of water from her nightstand and throws it on R2. It shorts out the droid, allowing Han to grab the packs and turn them off. Luke and 3PO log into a computer and discover that they are on the Eye of Palpatine. Something has turned the superweapon on, and it's trying to fulfill its mission: to pick up stormtroopers from planets along the Outer Rim and destroy the Jedi colony on Belsavis. But with the stormtroopers gone, the ship's mission program, something called the Will, is mistakenly gathering aliens from the worlds where the garrisons were located. And everywhere they look, lights and wires and electronics are missing. Why? Because the Will picked up a group of Jawas from Tatooine. Now the clock is ticking even faster. Not only does Luke have 2 days to save Krey and stop the destruction of Plawwal, he must do it before the Jawas destroy the life support systems on the Eye. Luke and 3PO start looking for a way to the upper decks where Krey is being held when they turn a corner and find a hallway filled with dead Afetekans. It's carnage. The sentient plants look like they were hacked apart. Oh no, Luke says. Because if the Eye picked up Jawas on Tatooine, it must have picked up something else. Tusken Raiders. Leia and Han call Mara Jade to tell her about what they found in the smuggling tunnels beneath Plett's library. Mara says there were rumors about something weird happening on Plawwal since a local smuggling boss disappeared a few years ago. Leia also tells Mara about Rogonda Ismarin. Mara freezes at the sound of the woman's name. Rogonda was Force sensitive, and the Emperor also trained her to use the dark side of the Force. She was another one of his hands, Mara says. Luke and 3PO can't find a way to the Eye's computer core except through a vertical shaft that's protected by an electrical grid. But it's impossible to climb through the shaft alone. One person must elevate through the shaft while another needs to keep the bolts from hitting them. Without Krey or Nikos, Luke doesn't see any way to stop the eye. But someone else did stop the superweapon 30 years ago. And soon, Luke discovers who that was. A Jedi named Callista contacts Luke. She and another Jedi named Geeth Eris found the Eye of Palpatine after Order 66. Callista says she climbed the shaft and entered the ship's core, while Geeth tried to disrupt the firing of the electrical grid. However, Geeth couldn't stop all the electricity from hitting Callista. Just before her body died, Callista says she used the Force to transfer her consciousness into the Eye's computer core. She's been there ever since, sitting beside the will and keeping the Eye inert. But Callista says about a week ago, something turned the will on, and now she's powerless to stop it from destroying Plowwall. Leia searches for Roganda Ismarin and finds the former Emperor's hand meeting two members of the ancient houses and some former Imperial officers. The conspirators want to announce Roganda's son Eric as Palpatine's son and proclaim the teenager as the new Emperor. Eric is trained in the dark side of the Force, and with the help of a computer implant in his brain, Eric can influence droids and other electronic devices. It was Eric who caused R2 to go haywire, and it was Eric who reanimated the will. Leia is captured by the conspirators, but she is able to escape and flee through the hanging vine cars on the tracks above Plowwall. Eric chases her through the vine cars, but R2 warns Han and Chewie what's happening. They rescue Leia and try to capture Eric, but the teenager flees back to his mother. The two flee Plowwall and leave Belsavis before their partners can stop them. Leia warns the royal conspirators they need to prepare for the Eye of Palpatine's arrival. But it's too late, because at that moment, the superweapon drops out of hyperspace and into orbit around the planet. On the Eye, Luke uses the Force to break the brainwashing hold the will has on the aliens. He convinces the Gamorreans to help him rescue Krey, Nikos, and Triv. With the help of the Jawas, Luke and his squad evade the will's defenses and free the two Jedi and the former stormtrooper. Luke tells them about the Eye's mission and the only way to the computer core. He wants to know if Krey can build a computer for Callista to transfer her consciousness into before he blows up the station. But Callista says no. There isn't time. Reluctantly, Luke agrees. He orders Triv and 3PO to herd all the aliens into the hangar bay. They'll split the aliens between two shuttles and then lure the Tuskens onto a third. 3PO will pilot one of the shuttles, and Triv will pilot the second, with the third shuttle holding the Tuskens slaved to Triv's controls. As Luke finishes speaking to the group, Krey lifts a blaster and fires, stunning the Jedi Master. When Luke regains consciousness, he finds himself sitting in the passenger seat of a shuttle beside 3PO. The droid says that Krey couldn't allow Luke to sacrifice himself. He says Krey used the Force to lift Nikos up the shaft and into the computer core. The droid was able to withstand getting hit by the electrical grid more than a living person ever could. Luke says a silent goodbye to Callista, Krey, and Nikos, and then watches in silence as the Eye of Palpatine explodes. The story ends with Luke and 3PO docking with the Millennium Falcon in orbit around Belsavis. As Leia tells her brother about Eric and Roganda, Chewie picks up a signal in the debris from the Eye. Han and Mara use the Falcon's tractor beam to reel in an escape pod. When they bring it aboard, Krey emerges. But it's not Krey. It looks like Luke's student, but even though they were all looking at Krey's face, the woman standing before them is just different. And her eyes aren't brown like Kray's. Her eyes are gray. Luke embraces the woman, bringing her into a kiss. Leia, Han, Mara, Luke says, "This is Callista." Time to take a break. When we return, I'll talk more about Children of the Jedi. I'm Aaron Moats. Stay tuned. You're listening to the Star Wars Legends Lounge. Thank you for listening to the Star Wars Legends Lounge, where we celebrate the books from Star Wars Legends. But allow me to recommend a book from Star Wars canon. Queen's Hope tells the story of Padme Amidala undertaking a secret mission during the Clone War, while her handmaiden and best friend, Sabe, doubles for Padme in the Senate. It's a fast-paced tale that's a fitting end to the Padme Amidala Queen's trilogy. That's Queen's Hope by E.K. Johnston. Welcome back to the Star Wars Legends Lounge, the show that celebrates the books from Star Wars Legends. I'm Aaron Moats, and today I'm talking about Children of the Jedi by Barbara Hambly, the first of the 3 books in what many fans call the Callista Chronicles. For many fans of the expanded universe, the 3 Callista books are not as well received as many other Legends stories. I agree. These 3 books are average at best. I think Children of the Jedi is probably my favorite of the 3. I think Darksaber, the second book, is my least favorite of the 3. That one's written by Kevin J. Anderson. And in the third book, Planet of Twilight, Barbara Hambly comes back. And I think, for me, that one's just a little bit better than Darksaber. One reason why many Legends fans don't like these books is because they started shipping Luke and Mara from the Heir to the Empire trilogy. And many fans could not see Luke with anyone else. You know, it was different in The Truce at Bakura, the book that came directly after the events of Return of the Jedi. Luke is still 23 years old. He meets this former Imperial on the planet Bakura, Gariel Captason. And I think many fans accepted that because it was young love, at least in Luke's eyes. It was an infatuation. That's a better word for it. It was an infatuation for Luke following the events of the original trilogy. But then on the timeline, 5 years later, you have the Heir to the Empire trilogy, and we are introduced to Mara Jade, one of the most memorable characters in all of Legends. It starts out as this tortured young woman who was trained by the worst person in the Star Wars universe, Emperor Palpatine, and fighting the demons inside of her, the ones telling her to kill Luke Skywalker. By the end of the trilogy, she slays those demons. She breaks the hold that Palpatine's ghost has on her. And while I won't say that Luke and Mara are friends at the end of the trilogy, they respect each other. The next set of books that were published were the books in the Jedi Academy trilogy. Mara shows up again in there. And now you have Luke helping to train Mara in the light side of the Force. So it's obviously natural for fans who have spent many, many, many hours reading these stories to grow fond of the idea of Luke and Mara growing closer and closer and closer to each other. Now, most fans who are familiar with Legends know that there weren't many rules by Lucasfilm for what the authors could write about. There were a handful, but there weren't many. And there really wasn't an overarching direction for where the stories should go. There were some notes, but for the most part, the authors were allowed to do what they wanted. According to Kevin J. Anderson, one of the notes Lucasfilm had for Barbara Hambly and himself was to create a character that was going to be the love of Luke Skywalker's life. I'll get more into this in the next episode, Darksaber, because there are things that happen in that book that the quotes I have found by Anderson, they are more directly applicable to what he is talking about in Darksaber. So I don't want to confuse anybody by telling you some of the specifics now in this story. Hambly was starting to put this story together as Zahn was finishing up The Last Command and Anderson was writing the Jedi Academy trilogy. So I understand why this book and the next two books that I'm going to talk about here on the show are not as well received by many EU fans as many of the other books in the EU. The Heir to the Empire trilogy, for most Legends fans, are the pinnacle. They're what started the Legends continuity as we know it. Were there expanded universe stories prior to 1991? Yes. There were some in the late 70s and in the early 80s. However, when most people are talking about the expanded universe, they're talking about the stories that started after 1991. And even though I am not a fan of the Jedi Academy trilogy, those books have many, many fans. They are more popular in the expanded universe than the 3 Callista stories. I'll admit, I remember the first time reading this, not feeling that Luke and Mara should be together, because I think I was one of the few people. I was a young teenager. I was one of the few people that did not read the interactions between Luke and Mara in the Heir of the Empire trilogy or the Jedi Academy trilogy. I did not read those as romantic, but the romance in this story, Children of the Jedi, between Luke and Callista, always felt weird to me. You have Luke injured, feverish. He's battling some kind of infection in his leg. He's drawing on the Force basically to keep himself lucid in order to try to rescue all the aliens on the Eye of Palpatine, rescue Krey, Nikos, Triv, get them off the ship, and then stop the ship from completing its mission. And here you have this ethereal, ghost-like voice, not like the Force ghosts we remember from the original trilogy, seeing Obi-Wan Kenobi, but here, Callista initially is speaking through the computer terminals. Luke is reading the words and then typing in questions. And it advances to Luke can just speak into the air and Callista will answer on the computer screens. Again, it advances to where Luke can start to see Callista in the times that he's trying to rest. When he takes a nap to gather his strength, he sees Callista in his dreams. There's one moment where it appears that there's this ethereal form in a mirror that Luke sees. The other part of the romance that always felt weird to me is that Luke's on a timetable. He basically has 2 days to stop the Eye of Palpatine and save all of the people who are on the ship. And while he's trying to figure out how to do these things, he's having all these interactions with the Jawas, with the Afitekans, with the Gamorreans. But he's continually having these conversations with this Jedi consciousness that is in the computer terminals in the ship. And over the span of about a day and a half, Luke falls in love with her. He has a dream where he actually sees her and they embrace and they kiss and they have this extremely deep, meaningful conversation about their lives and spending it together. Again, Luke is on a timetable. This ship is going to destroy Belsavis. It's going to kill his sister, his best friend, Chewbacca, all of the people in the Plawwall Rift Valley. So it just feels weird to me. And I think that may be another reason why Children of the Jedi and the other two quote-unquote Callista Chronicles are not as well received as many other Star Wars Legends stories. That's not to say that there aren't some really good things in this book. I think this is one of the few stories in Legends where the Force is shown the way I remember the Force being explained and described in the original trilogy. It's not a comic book power like it is in many other Legends stories. It's not a video game power-up like it is in many other Legends stories. In this book, we see the amount of energy that Luke has to use to continually use the Force. We see how much it costs him to use the Force that much. Granted, some of that is the exhaustion he's feeling from his leg injury and the fever he's trying to hold at bay, but he is using the Force to do these things. He's using the Force to hold the fever at bay. He's using the Force at times to levitate 3PO between turbo lift levels. He's using the Force to help keep him upright and walk with his crutch. He's using the Force to communicate with Callista. And it's draining. He has to continually rest. He has to continually recharge. The things he can do in this are not limitless. It feels different than many other Legends stories to me, because many of those other stories make the Force feel completely limitless. And I'm not saying it isn't, because I like the fact that the Force has no limit. What I don't like is someone being able to tap into all aspects of the Force basically because the plot needs them to. So I will give Barbara Hambly a lot of credit for this. I prefer the description of the Force that Hambly writes in this book than I did the way Timothy Zahn wrote the Force in the Heir to the Empire trilogy, or the way Kevin J. Anderson wrote it in the Jedi Academy trilogy. For me, that is my favorite thing about Children of the Jedi. That being said, there is one aspect of the Force in this book that I'm not a fan of, because Hambly describes the Force being passed down through families at a much higher rate than I think Lucas ever wanted it described. She talks about how powerful Jedi are much more likely to have children who are powerful Jedi. And maybe there is some truth to that. But I always go back to George Lucas describing the Force, saying that anyone can tap into it, that anyone can use it. Some people are more naturally talented, but with enough hard work and enough discipline, anyone can use the Force. Anyone can become powerful with it. Now, Hambly doesn't say in this story that the ability to use the Force only passes down through family genetics. She doesn't do that. But she does describe that it's more likely for Jedi to have powerful Jedi offspring. And that I'm not a fan of. One thing I will give Hambly, you can tell she knows how to write. She's an excellent writer. I'm not sure her excellent writing ability is best used in Star Wars. The story is slow in parts. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. It's just, I find that the more compelling Star Wars stories usually move fairly quickly. It's built into the saga. It's a combination of rollicking space adventure, morality tale, and soap opera. I think Hambly gets the morality tale and the soap opera. This story, and later on Planet of Twilight, she doesn't get the rollicking space adventure as well, in my opinion. So, what do you make of the Callista Chronicles? I can see what Lucasfilm wanted, beginning with this book. And I think if this book and the next two books were better received, it would have definitely changed the direction of the expanded universe. I would be interested to see how it would have changed the New Jedi Order series, which is my favorite series in the expanded universe. Would it have happened at all? Who knows? All we can say for sure is the timeline after this book would have been vastly different. Before I wrap up the discussion on the book, I do have to mention that for those of you who have been listening to the Star Wars Legends Lounge from the beginning, you'll know that when I read a couple of the Clone Wars stories for the very first time, I'm speaking specifically of the Clone Wars No Prisoners, where Callista and Geeth and Jedi Master Altus show up. they interact with Ahsoka Tano and with Pelion. I really like their inclusions in that story. In fact, it was my favorite use of Callista in Legends. I still think it would have been really interesting to see how a different sect of Jedi think about the Force. And I'm not just talking about how Qui-Gon Jinn thinks about the Force. I'm talking about if there was this rogue sect that talked about the importance of relationships, if it didn't always talk about the dangers of love, if that was somehow included in the prequel films, I think that would have been a really interesting thing for Anakin to deal with. I understand why it wasn't. That's not what George Lucas believes, and ultimately this is his story. It would have been really interesting to see how Anakin would have dealt with Yoda and Obi-Wan and the other members of the Jedi Order. Well, it's almost time to go, but first, let's hear from Ian again. He had some thoughts about some things that I have said on the podcast, specifically the real-world references I like to point out in the books and the number of Jedi that survived Order 66. Ian says, I like when you bring up real-world terms that end up in some of the books, like baseball. Did you know that J.R.R. Tolkien also did that in The Lord of the Rings? From a long-expected party in the Fellowship of the Ring, quote, the dragon passed like an express train, turned a somersault, and burst over Bywater with a deafening explosion, unquote. He did that as the narrator was trying to describe something to give the reader context, even though, of course, there weren't express trains in Middle-earth. Also, you mentioned that you're not pleased with the amount of Jedi that seem to have survived Order 66. I'm okay with this. The way I look at it, there were thousands of Jedi over thousands of systems, and not all of them were attached to clone troopers. So, I think it would be unlikely that the Empire would have gotten them all. That said, there were only 2 masters that survived Order 66. Ahsoka had left the Jedi, Kanan Jarrus wasn't a master, and Ezra Bridger didn't even know he was Force sensitive. If more masters had survived, I would agree with you. Thank you very much for your opinions, Ian. Well, it's time to wrap up. Listener, if you'd like to get in touch with the show, you can send me an email at swlegendslounge@gmail.com or send me a message on Twitter, Instagram, or Blue Sky at swlegendslounge. Send me a question. Send me your opinions about the books I've talked about on the show. Or if I said something that you disagree with, let me know. I'll read it on the podcast. And keep sending in your Star Wars character groupings. Your fighter squadrons, your Mount Rushmores, your road trip crews. Now the actors and actresses that you envision playing these Legends characters. Send them all in. I love reading them for the show. Coming up on the next episode, it's the second book in the Callista Chronicles, Darksaber by Kevin J. Anderson. You can look forward to that episode coming out on December 13th. Ooh, Friday the 13th. And coincidentally, that's my brother's birthday this year. Do with that what you will. Once again, thank you so much for listening to the Star Wars Legends Lounge. I'm Aaron Moats. May the Force be with you. And remember, there's always a bit of truth in Legends.